and uranium go toward energy independence or go on the world market to the highest bidder, would it be kept in Virginia?
I mean, that's not something that the regulatory agencies would have any say in. We have no idea.
Okay, thank you. The third question I have on uranium, processed uranium will be shipped out of state, but left behind will be huge volumes of radioactive and toxic waste. Where will this waste be disposed of?
As I discussed earlier, the mill tailings would remain on site in a location and a containment structure approved by the regulating authority.
Okay, the next couple of questions I have, actually, the one question I had on radon. The NAS study committee was very clear in its conclusion that the current MSHA radon decay product exposure limit for uranium mine workers needs to be revised. Dr. Bill Field has stated that there is a 6% risk of developing lung cancer for radon exposure at the current limit of 4 working level months per year, shown on your slide number 7. Do you accept this limit as appropriate for Virginia?
No, we do not. The current National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, has proposed a standard of 1 working level month per year exposure limit, and we would set that as part of the radiation protection plan for any miner that working.
Thank you. The next section of questions is on regulations. Does DEQ, DMME have resources to write regulations for the facility, monitoring, billing, reclamation, and cleanup?
Speaking for DEQ, we currently have enough staffing to develop the regulations that we and review the regulations that we need to review under our program.
Can you repeat that? I couldn't hear.
Yes, we have enough staff to write the regulations that we would need to write for the Department of Environmental Quality.
We are the Division of Mineral Mining, but we're in the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy. And in the Department of Mines, Minerals, and Energy, we have sufficient staffing to help with writing regulation.
Okay, can you hear that? So they both have that? Okay. Second question in this category. In its review of potential issues associated with the state pursuing authority for regulation of regulating a uranium mill, has the UWG considered the need for technically qualified hearing officers and the resources needed for a hearing as would be required under the Atomic Energy Act section, I believe it's 274?
Yes, in fact, the process by which Virginia could, if it chose to do so, if the government chose to do so, become an agreement state, would certainly involve that process. Actually, would you please repeat the question I didn't mention a second?
Yes. In its review of potential issues associated with the state pursuing authority for regulating a uranium mill, has the UWG considered the need for technically qualified hearing officers and the resources necessary for hearing as would be required under the Atomic Energy Act, Section 274?
If Virginia were to become approved by the NRC as an agreement state, we would have those assets available. We would be required to follow the NRC process as it is currently written, that would include those hearing processes and be open for public comment.
Has the UWG considered what regulatory and statutory changes might be required to the Virginia Administrative Process Act, CF 2.2-4020, to ensure that the requirements of the Atomic Energy Act Section 274, which include a licensing hearing for a mill, including cross-examination, might be required should the state pursue an agreement state revision to allow the state to regulate the uranium mill. I did not drink enough coffee this evening to read that out clearly enough. Hopefully that made sense.
So we can give a general answer. We wouldn't be looking at making any changes to the Administrative Process Act, but that doesn't mean that in the individual agencies of authorities that they can't have additional requirements. And that the Department of Environmental Quality under the State Water Control Board and the State Air Pollution Control Board, we have additional public participation requirements above and beyond the APA, and that's something you wouldn't, if you needed additional for a specific purpose, you don't need to amend the Administrative Process Act to accomplish that.
Thank you. Okay. This question, how will the General Assembly oversee or have oversight of the regulatory process and beyond? Yes. How will the General Assembly oversee or have oversight of the regulating process and beyond?
They have existing processes whereby they review the regulatory authority. I understand there's a standing committee that does that, but we have no idea what the General Assembly is going to do. I mean, it's their prerogative.
This is a question that seems to follow up on that. What kind of public inputs will go into the process of developing regulations for uranium mining?
Well, there's, as I stated, we've got the full requirements of the Administrative Process Act. In addition, individual agencies have additional public participation requirements in their specific programs. But actually, Virginia's Administrative Process Act is actually pretty extensive and probably one of the more extensive ones in the country as far as the level of public participation. So it's a strong program. But we will have some recommendations for additional public participation opportunities in our final report.
Would you please comment on your group's UWG scope with respect to conceptual regulatory framework for an industry which is currently illegal? Would you do the same thing for moonshine or marijuana?
Well, honestly, if the governor told me to do it, I would probably. What we're trying to address in the studies is there are a number of questions that have been raised with these recent studies. And we're trying to look at those specific questions and the specific risk and see what's the best possible way to mitigate the risk that are raised in those issues. And that's what we're trying to do. This is our best shot at how you could develop a program to minimize those risks to the extent practical. And that's what we'll be proposing. It's up to the General Assembly to decide whether or not that's sufficient mitigation.
How will the Commonwealth's experience in regulating radiation exposure in commercial, research, and medical settings inform regulations for uranium mining?
The process for uranium milling and monitoring radiation exposure is not inherently different than that of any other nuclear generating facility. We have that experience and would use our past experiences and best practices and lessons learned and apply it to this process were it to be approved.
I believe this is stated, but I'm going to ask this again to make sure it's clear. If Virginia becomes a full agreement state, do any of the NRC regulations apply?
For Virginia to become an agreement state, we would have to incorporate the NRC regulations into our regulations, and we would then become responsible for all regulatory aspects of the uranium milling process, subject to periodic review by the NRC and validation of our ability to continue to do so.
Thank you. Does Virginia currently have regulations in place regarding the presence of radionuclides in surface water, groundwater? If so, what are they?
We do have water quality standards for both groundwater and surface water for radionuclides, but we think that those need to be reviewed, and we're recommending a process for that review, or at least that's been our discussion, to have a scientific advisory committee look at those standards. But we do have radionuclide standards for both surface water and groundwater and drinking water.
There are also specific standards for public water supplies. However, there are not, at the current time, standards for private wells, and VDH does not have the authority to regulate private wells. And that's an important fact. We would also be responsible for monitoring recreational water use, so swimmable surface waters. But again, the commissioner currently does not have the statutory authority to close swimmable surface waters if there were high concentrations. So that is one of the areas that we've looked at in terms of requiring some regulatory changes.
Okay, what procedures do regulators require for the storing of yellow cake on site?
As part of the application and permitting process, the NRC has a rigorous procedure, again, you'll hear this several times, outlined in 10 CFR 40 Appendix A for the mill per se, but also 10 CFR 20 outlines the regulatory radiation exposure limits that would have to be maintained and followed by the owner-operator.
This is kind of a two-part. Given that you stated the Virginia regulations will be developed after NRC had granted agreement status, could you clarify the process for becoming an agreement state regarding regulating the mill? In particular, would you state, would the state develop regulations for regulating the mill prior to NRC approving the agreement state amendment?
In terms of the radiation protection program, our regulations, again, would follow the NRC's regulations and be incorporated either directly or by reference. Yes, they have to be in place prior to the operation if that's